For 50 years, they lay under glass in the Dickerson Museum, and they were labeled the Medici Boots. They were fashioned of creamy leather, pliable as a young girl's hands. They were threaded with silver, appliqued with sapphire silks and scarlet, and set on the tip of each was a pale and lovely amethyst. Such were the Medici Boots. Old Silas Dickerson, globetrotter and collector, had brought the boots from a dusty shop in Florence when he was a young man filled with the lust for travel and adventure. The years passed, and Silas Dickerson was an old man, his hair white, his eyes dim, his veined hands trembling with the ague that precedes death. When he was 90 and the years of his wanderings over, Silas Dickerson died one morning as he sat in a high-backed Venetian chair in his private museum. The 14th century gold leaf paintings, the Japanese processional banners, the stolen bones of a Normandy saint, all the beloved trophies of his travels must have watched the dead man impassively for hours before his housekeeper found him. The old man sat with his head thrown back against the faded tapestry of the Venetian chair, his eyes closed, his bony arms extended along the beautifully carved arms of the chair, and on his lap lay the Medici Boots. It was high noon when they found him, and the sun was streaming through the stained glass window above the chair and picking at the amethysts, so that the violet stones seemed to eye Marta, the old housekeeper, with an impudent glitter. Marta muttered a prayer and crossed herself, before she ran like a scared rabbit with the news of the master's death. Silas Dickerson's only surviving relatives, the 3 young Delameters, did not take too seriously the note which was found among the papers in the museum's desk. Old Silas had written the note. It was addressed to John Delameter, for John was his uncle's favorite, but John's pretty wife, Suzanne, and his twin brother, Dr. Eric, read it over his shoulder, and they all smiled tolerantly. Old Dickerson had written of things incomprehensible to the young moderns. The contents of my private museum are yours, John, to do with as you see fit. Merely as a suggestion, I would say that the Antiquarian Society would snap up many of the things. A very few are of no particular value, except to me. One thing I want done, however. The Medici Boots of ivory leather must either be destroyed or be put forever under glass in a public museum. I prefer that they be destroyed, for they are a dangerous possession. They have gone to the adulterous rendezvous celebrated in the scandalous verses of Lorenzo the Magnificent. They have shod the feet of a murderess. They were cursed by the church as trappings of the devil, inciting the wearer to foul deeds and intrigue. I shall not disturb you with all their hideous history, but I repeat, they are a dangerous possession. I have taken care to keep them under lock and key, behind plate glass, for more than 50 years. I have never taken them out. Destroy the Medici Boots before they destroy you. But he did take them out, cried Suzanne. Uncle was holding the boots when Marta found him there in the museum. John reread the note and looked thoughtfully at his young wife. Yes, perhaps he was preparing to destroy them right then. Of course, I think the poor old fellow took things a bit too seriously. He was very old, you know, and Marta says he practically lived in this museum of his. And why call a pair of old boots dangerous? Of course, we all know the Medicis were plenty dangerous, but the Medici Boots? That's ridiculous, John. Besides... Suzanne paused provocatively, her red lips pouting. She looked down at her trimly shod feet. Besides, I'd like to try on those Medici Boots, just once. They're lovely, I think. John was frowning thoughtfully. He scarcely heard her suggestion. He spoke to Eric instead, and his voice seemed a bit troubled. I believe that Uncle was getting ready to destroy those boots that very morning he died, else why should he have taken them from their case after 50 years? Yes, I believe you're right, John, because that note is dated fully a month before Uncle's death. I think he brooded over leaving those boots to one he cared for. Poor old man. I wouldn't call him so, Eric. He had his dreams of adventure realized more fully than most men. I think I'll do as he says. I'll destroy the Medici Boots. If you'd feel better about it, assented his brother. But Suzanne did not speak. She was looking at her shoe, pursing her lips thoughtfully, seeing her feet encased in the gay embroideries of the Medici Boots. John seemed relieved by his decision. Yes, I'd better do it. We'll be getting back to town in a few days. Old Erskine, you know, Uncle's lawyer, is coming down this afternoon. Then soon we'll be on the wing, Susie and I, Vienna, Paris, the Alps, thanks to Uncle. "Maybe you think I'm not thankful for my chance at a bit more work at Johns Hopkins," said Eric, and they did not again speak of the Medici Boots. The deaf old lawyer of the Dickerson estate arrived, and Suzanne, with the easy capability that was part of her charm, saw that he was made comfortable. At 7, there was a perfect dinner served on the awning terrace outside the softly lit living room. The stars aided the 2 little rosy lamps on the table, and swaying willows beside a stone-encircled pool swung the incense of the garden about them. As dinner ended, John took from the pocket of his coat a small limp leather book. He pushed back his dessert plate and laid the book on the table, tapping it with a finger as he spoke. "This is the history of the Medici Boots. It was in a little wall safe in the museum. After all Uncle said of the Medici Boots, shall we read it?" And turning to the old lawyer, he told of Silas Dickerson's letter concerning the boots. Erskine shook his head, smiling. "Most collectors get an exaggerated sense of the supernatural. Read this, by all means. It should prove interesting." "Yes, read it, John." Suzanne and Eric spoke almost together. So, in the circle of rosy light at their little table, John read the story of the Medici Boots. It was not a long story, and it was told in the language of an anonymous translator. But as John read on, his listeners were drawn together, as by a spell. They scarcely breathed, and the summer night that was so mildly beautiful seemed to take on a sense of hovering danger. "In the palace of Giuliano de' Medici, I have lived long. I am an old woman now, as the years are reckoned in this infamous place, though I am but 53. Separated from my betrothed, duped, sold into the marble labyrinth of this hateful place, it was long before my spirit broke and I went forth, bejeweled and attired in elegance, among the silk-clad Florentines. I was labeled the most beautiful mistress of any of the Medici. I was smirked at, fawned upon for my lord's favors, obscenely jested about in the orgies that took place in the great banquet hall of the palace. But in my heart always lay the remembrance of my lost love, and in my soul grew black hatred for the Medici and all their kind. I, who had dreamed only of a modest home, a kind husband, black-haired, trusting little children, was made a tool of the Medici infamy. In time, I almost felt myself in league with the devil. Secretly, and with a growing sense of elation, I made frequent rendezvous with a foul hag whose very name was anathema to the churchly folk of Florence. In her hole of a room, in a certain noisome street, she imparted to me those terrible secrets of the black arts which were deep in her soul. It was amusing that she was paid in Medici gold. The corruption of the Medici bred in them fear, in me a sort of reckless bravery. It was I who poisoned the wine of many a foe of the Medici. It was I who put the point of a dagger in the heart of the old Prince de Vittorio, whose lands and power and palaces were coveted by my lord Giuliano. After a time, bloodshed became an exhilaration to me. The death agonies of those who drank the poisoned cup became more interesting than the flattery of the Medici followers. Even the ladies of the house of the Medici did me the honor of their subtly barbed friendliness. Through this very friendliness, I conceived my plan of sweet revenge upon the monsters who had ruined my life. With so great a hatred boiling in my soul that my mind reeled, my senses throbbed, my heart rose in my throat like a spurt of flame, I cursed 3 things of exquisite beauty with all the fervor of my newly learned lessons in devilish lore. These 3 beautiful objects I presented to 3 ladies of the house of Medici, presented them with honeyed words of mock humility. A necklace of jeweled links. I pledged myself to the devil and willed that the golden necklace would tighten on the soft throat of the lady of the Medici while she slept, and strangle her into black death. A bracelet of filigree and sapphires, to pierce by its hidden silver needle the blue vein in a white Medici wrist, so that her life's blood would spurt, and she would know the terror that the house of the Medici gave to others. Last, and most ingenious, a pair of creamy boots, pliable, embroidered in silver and silks, encrusted with amethysts, my betrothal jewels. In my hatred I cursed the boots, willing that the wearer, as long as a shred of the boots remained, should kill as I had killed, poison as I had poisoned, leave all thoughts of home and husband, and live in wantonness and evil. So I cursed the beautiful boots, forgetting in my hate that perhaps another than a Medici might, in the years to come, wear them and become the devil's pawn, even as I am now. In my life, the Medici will have the boots, of that I feel sure, but after that, I can only hope that this bloody history of the boots may be found when I am no more, and may it be a warning. I have lived to see my gifts received and worn, and I have laughed in my soul to see my curses bring death and terror and evil to 3 Medici women. I know not what will become of the golden necklace, the bracelet, or the boots. The boots may be lost or stolen, or they may lie in a Medici palace for age on age, but the curse will cling to them till they are destroyed. So I pray that no woman, save a Medici, will ever wear them. As I live and breathe and do the bidding of the lords of Florence, the accursed Medici, I have told the truth. When I am dead, perhaps they will find this book, and in hell I shall know and be glad. Maria Medina di Cavour, Florence, 1476. Phew, said old Erskine. John laughed. I don't suppose this charming history would have been any more thrilling if I had read it from the original book, in Italian, of course. Wonder where Uncle got it. There was no mention of it being in the library, but there it was. Now will you destroy those boots? Asked Eric, and he was not entirely in jest. But Suzanne said, laughingly, not before I find out if the Medici lady had a smaller foot than I. Are they still in the museum, John? Never you mind, my dear. They're not for the likes of you. Oh, don't be silly, John. This is 1955, not the 15th century. And they laughed at Suzanne's earnestness. The book that held the story of the Medici boots lay on the white cloth, looking like a book of lovely verse. Suzanne, a small white blur against the summer dark, sat quietly while the men talked of Silas Dickerson, his life, his mania for collecting, his death that had so fittingly come to him in his museum. It was nearly 12 when Suzanne left the men on the terrace, and with a quiet goodnight entered the living room and crossed to the long shining stairs. The men went on with their talk. Once, John, looking toward the jutting wing that was the museum, exclaimed, "Look at that, will you? I swear I saw a light in the museum." "You locked it, didn't you?" asked Eric. "Of course, the key's in my desk upstairs." I'm probably mistaken, but it did seem as though a light shone there just a moment ago." "Reflection from the living room window, I think. Country life is making you jittery, John." And Eric laughed at his brother. The men sat on, reluctant to leave the beauty of the night, and it was almost 2 o'clock when they finally went inside. John said, "I think I'll not disturb Suzanne," and he went to sleep in a wide 4-poster bed in a room next to his wife. Eric and the old lawyer were in rooms across the hall. The still summer night closed about the house of Silas Dickerson, and when the moon lay dying against the bank of cloud, puffed across the sky by the little wind that came before dawn, young Dr. Eric Delameter awoke, suddenly and completely, to a feeling of clammy apprehension. He had not locked his door, and now, across the grayness of the room, he saw it slowly opening. A hand was closed around the edge of the door, a woman's hand, small and white and jeweled. Eric sat straight and tense on the edge of his bed, peering across the room. A woman, young and slender, in a long trailing gown, came toward him, smiling. It was Suzanne. With a gasp, Eric watched her approach till she stood directly before him. "Suzanne, you're asleep? Shall I call John?" He thought that perhaps he should not waken her. There were things one must remember about sleepwalkers, but physicians scarcely believed them. Eric was puzzled too by her costume. It was not a nightrobe she wore, but an elaborate trailing dress, upon which embroideries in silver shone faintly. Her short black curls were bound about 3 times with strands of pearly beads. Her slim white arms were loaded with bracelets. The pointed toes of little shoes peeped beneath her gown, little shoes of creamy leather. An amethyst gleamed on each toe. The sight of these amethyst tips affected Eric strangely, much as though he thought he had looked at something hideously repulsive. He stood up and put out a hand to touch Suzanne's arm. "Suzanne," he said gently, "let me take you to John, shall I?" Suzanne looked up at him, and her brown eyes, usually so merry, were deeply slumberous, not with sleep, but with a look of utter abandon. She shook her pearl-bound head slowly, smilingly. "No, not John. I want you, Eric." Mad. Suzanne must be mad, was Eric's quick thought, but her caress was swifter than his thought. Both jewel-laden arms about his neck, Suzanne kissed him, her red lips pouting warmly upon his. "Suzanne, you don't know what you're doing." He grasped both her hands in his, and with a haste that would have seemed ludicrous to him had he viewed the scene in a picture play, he hurried her out of his room and across the hall. Eric opened her door softly, and with no gentle hand shoved Suzanne inside her room. She seemed like a little animal in his grasp. She hissed at him, clawed and scratched at his hand, but when he had shut the door, she did not open it again, and after a moment he went back to his own room. His mouth set in a firm line, his heart beating fast, Eric locked his door with a noiseless turn of the key. It was almost dawn, and the garden lay like a rare pastel outside his window, but Eric saw none of it. He scarcely thought, though his lips moved, as if chaotic words were struggling for utterance. He looked down at his hand, where 2 long red scratches oozed a trickle of blood. After he had washed his hand, he lay down on his bed and covered his eyes with his arm against the picture of Suzanne. Above all else, there stood out the gleaming tips of her little shoes, as he had glimpsed them through the dim light of his room when she came toward him. She wore the Medici Boots. Suzanne must have taken them from the museum. Eric rather dreaded breakfast, but when he came down at 8 to the terrace where a rustic table was set invitingly, he found John and the lawyer awaiting him. John greeted his brother affectionately. "Morning, old boy. Hope you slept well. Why so solemn? Feeling seedy?" No, I'm perfectly all right," Eric replied hastily, relieved that Suzanne was not present. He added with a scarcely noticeable hesitation, "Suzanne not coming down?" "No," replied John easily. "She seemed to want to sleep a while. Send her regrets. She'll see us at lunch." John went on, "I certainly had a nightmare last night. Thought a woman in a long shining dress came into my room and tried to stab me. This morning I found that a glass on my bed table was overturned and broken, and by George I'd cut my wrist on it." He showed a jagged cut on his wrist. "Take a look, Dr. Eric." Eric looked at the cut carefully. "Not bad, but you might have bled to death had it been 1/4 inch to the left. If you like, I'll fix it up a bit for you after breakfast." Eric's voice was calm enough, but his pulse was pounding, his heart sick. All morning he rode through the countryside adjoining the Dickerson estate, but he let the mare go as she liked and where she liked, for his mind was busy with the events of the hour before dawn. He knew that the slash on his brother's wrist was made by steel, not glass. Yet when the ride was over, he could not bring himself to tell John of Suzanne's visit. "She must have been sleepwalking, though I can't account for the way she was decked out. I've always thought Suzanne extremely modest in her dress, certainly not inclined to load herself with jewelry. And those boots, John must get them today and destroy them, as he said. Silly, perhaps, but..." His thoughts went on, always returning to the Medici Boots, in spite of himself. Eric came back from his ride at 11 o'clock, with as troubled a mind as when he began it. He almost feared to see Suzanne at lunch. When he did meet her with John and Mr. Erskine on the cool, shaded porch where they lunched, he saw there was nothing to fear. The amorous, clinging woman of the hour before dawn was not there at all. There was only the Suzanne whom Eric knew and loved as a sister. Here again was their merry little Suzanne, somewhat spoiled by her husband, it is true, but a Suzanne sweetly feminine, almost childish, in a crisp white frock and little low-heeled sandals. Their talk was lazily pleasant, of tennis honors and horses, of the prized delphiniums in the garden, of the tiny Maltese kitten which Suzanne had brought up from the stables late that morning and installed in a pink-bowed basket on the porch. She showed the kitten to Eric, handling its tiny paws gently, hushing its plaintive mews with ridiculous pet names. "Perhaps I'm a bigger fool than I know. Perhaps it never happened except in a dream," Eric told himself unhappily. And yet... He looked at the red marks on his hand, marks made by a furious Suzanne in that hour before the dawn. He also remembered the cut on John's wrist, the cut so near the vein. Eric declined John's invitation to go through the museum with him that afternoon, but he said with a queer sense of diffidence, "While you're there, John, you'd better get rid of the Medici Boots. Creepy things to have around, I think." "They'll be destroyed all right, but Suzanne is just bound to try them on. I'll get them, though, and do as Uncle said." Eric remained on the terrace, speculating somewhat on just what John and Suzanne would do, now that the huge fortune of Silas Dickerson was theirs. Eric was not envious of his brother's good luck, and he was thankful for his share in old Silas's generosity. At 5 o'clock he entered the hall, just as Suzanne hurried in from the kitchen. She spread out her hands laughingly. "With my own fair hands I've made individual almond tortonis for dessert. Cook thinks I'm a wonder. Each masterpiece in a fluted silver dish, silver candies sprinkled on the pink whipped cream." She made big eyes in mock gluttony. Eric forgot for a moment that there had ever been another Suzanne. "You're nothing but a little girl, Susie, you with your rhapsodies over pink whipped cream. But it's sweet of you to go to such trouble on a warm afternoon. See you and the whatever-you-call-ems at dinner. They're Tortonis, Eric, Tortonis." Suzanne ran lightly up the stairs. Eric followed more slowly. He entered his room thinking that there were some things which must be explained in this house with the old museum. 20 minutes before dinner, Eric and John were on the terrace waiting for Suzanne. John was talkative, which was just as well, as he might have wondered at his brother's silence. Eric was torn between a desire to tell his brother his reluctant suspicions concerning the Medici Boots and Suzanne, and his inclination to leave things alone till the boots could be destroyed. He said, diffidently, "John, does Suzanne have those boots?" John chuckled. "Why, yes, I saw them in her room. Do you know she went down to the museum last night and took those boots? It was a light I saw in the museum. It was her light. Suzanne has ideas. Wants to wear the boots just once, she says, to lay the ghost of this what's-her-name, Maria Modena. Suzanne says she couldn't sleep much last night, got up early and tried on those boots. Well, I think I'll destroy 'em tomorrow. Uncle's wish, so I'll do it." "Tried them on, did she?" "Well, if you should ask me, I'd say that history of the boots was a bit too exciting for Suzanne. It was a haunting story. Uncle must have swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, eh?" "Of course, his letter showed that. But Suzanne lives in the present, not the past, as Uncle did. I suppose Suzanne will wear those boots or she won't feel satisfied. I don't exactly like the idea, I must confess." Something like an electric shock passed through Eric. He said, somewhat breathlessly, "I don't think Suzanne ought to have the Medici boots." John looked at him curiously and laughed. "I never knew you were superstitious, Eric. But do you really think—" "I don't know what I think, John. But if she were my wife, I'd take those boots away from her. Uncle may have known what he was talking about." "Well, I think she's intending to wear them at dinner, so prepare to be dazzled. Here she is now. Greetings, sweetheart." Suzanne swept across the terrace, her gown goldly shimmering, pearls bound about her head, as Eric had seen her in the dim hour before dawn. Again, the rows of bracelets were weighting her slim arms, and she wore the Medici boots, the amethyst tips peeping beneath her shining dress. John, ever ready for gay clowning, arose and bowed low. "Hail, Empress. Aha, the dress you got in Florence on our honeymoon, isn't it? And those darned Medici boots." Suzanne unsmilingly extended her hand for him to kiss. John arched an eyebrow comically. "What's the matter, honey? Going regal on me?" And retaining her hand, he kissed each of her fingers. Suzanne snatched away her hand, and the glance she gave her husband was one of venomous haughtiness. To Eric, she turned a look that was an open caress, leaning toward him, putting a hand on his arm, as he stood beside his chair, stern-lipped, with eyes that would not look at John's hurt bewilderment. The three sat down then, in the low wicker chairs, and waited for dinner, three people with oddly different emotions. John was hurt, slightly impatient with his bride. Eric was furious with Suzanne, though there was in his heart the almost certain knowledge that the Suzanne beside them on the terrace was not the Suzanne they knew, but a cruelly strange woman, the product of a sinister force, unknown and compelling. No one, looking on Suzanne's red-lipped and heavy-lidded beauty, could miss the knowledge that here was a woman dangerously subtle, carrying a power more devastating than the darting lightning that now and then showed itself over the treetops of the garden. Eric began to feel something of this, and there shaped in his mind a wariness, a defense against this woman who was not Suzanne. "No alfresco dining tonight," said John, as the darkening sky was veined by a sudden spray of blue-green light. "Rain on the way. Pretty good storm, I'd say." "I like it," replied Suzanne, drawing in a deep breath of the sultry air. John laughed. "Since when, sweetheart? You usually shake and shiver through a thunderstorm." Suzanne ignored him. She smiled at Eric and said in a low tone, "And if I should lose my bravery, you would take care of me, wouldn't you, Eric?" Before Eric could reply, dinner was announced, and he felt a relief and also a dread. This dinner was going to be difficult. John offered his arm to his wife, smiling at her, hoping for a smile in return. But Suzanne shrugged and said in a caressing voice, "Eric?" Eric could only bow stiffly and offer his arm, while John walked slowly beside them, his face thoughtful, his gay spirits gone. During dinner, however, he tried to revive the lagging conversation. Suzanne spoke in a staccato voice, and her choice of words seemed strange to Eric, almost as though she were translating her own thoughts from a foreign tongue. And finally, Suzanne's promised dessert came, cool and tempting in its silver dishes. Eric saw a chance to make the talk more natural. He said gaily, "Johnny, your wife's a chef, a famous pastry chef. Behold the work of her hands. What did you say it was, Suzanne?" This? Oh, I don't know what it's called. But this afternoon as you were leaving the kitchen, didn't you say it was almond something or other? She shook her head, smiling. Perhaps it is. I wouldn't know. The maid had placed the tray with the 3 silver dishes of dessert before Suzanne, that she might put on them the final sprinkling of delicate silver candies. Daintily, Suzanne sifted the shining bubbles over the fluff of cream. Eric, watching her, felt very little surprise when he saw Suzanne, with almost legerdemain deftness, sift upon one dish a film of pinkish powder which could not be detected after it lay on the pink cream. Waiting, he knew not for what moment, he watched Suzanne pass the silver dishes herself, saw her offer the one with the powdered top to John. And it was then that their attention was attracted by the entrance of the Maltese kitten. So tiny it was, so brave in its careening totter across the shiny floor, small tail hoisted like a sail, that John and Eric laughed aloud. Suzanne merely glanced down at the little creature and turned away. The kitten, however, came to her chair, put up a tiny paw, and caught its curved claws in the fragile stuff of Suzanne's gown. Instantly, her face became distorted with rage, and she kicked out at the kitten, savagely and with set lips. It seemed to Eric that the amethysts on the Medici Boots winked wickedly in the light of the big chandelier. The kitten was flung some 10 feet away and lay in a small panting heap. John sprang up. "Suzanne, how could you?" He took the kitten in his arms and soothed it. "Why, its heart's beating like a trip hammer," he said. "I don't understand, Suzanne." As the kitten grew quiet, he took a large rose leaf from the table flowers and spread it with a heaping spoonful of the pink cream from his dessert. Then he put the kitten on the floor beside it. "Here, little one, lick this up. It's fancy eating. Suzanne's sorry, I know she is." The kitten, with the greed of its kind, devoured the cream, covering its small nose and whiskers with a pinkish film. Suzanne sat back in her chair, fingering her bracelets, her eyes on Eric's face. John watched the kitten, and Eric watched too, watched tensely, for he sensed what would happen to it. The kitten finished the cream, licked its paws and whiskers, and turned to walk away. Then it spun around in a frantic convulsion, and in a moment lay dead on its back, its tiny red tongue protruding, its paws rigid. Outside, the storm glowered, and in the chartreuse light of the forked lightning, the great chandelier was turned to a sickly radiance. Thunder rolled like muffled drums. Suddenly, Suzanne began to laugh, peal after peal of terrible laughter, and then, after a glare of lightning, the big chandelier winked out. The room was plunged into stormy darkness, and they could hear the rain lashing through the garden to hurl itself against the windows. "Don't be frightened, Suzanne." It was John's solicitous voice, and it was followed by a quick movement from Suzanne's side of the table. A sheet of blue-green light illuminated the room for an instant, and Eric saw Suzanne struggling in her husband's arms, one jeweled arm uplifted, and in her hand a shining dagger. With a bound that was almost involuntary, Eric reached them and struck at the knife in Suzanne's hand. It clattered to the floor. And as though the fury of the storm and Suzanne's madness both were spent, the slashing rain and the lightning stopped abruptly, and Suzanne ceased to struggle. "Light the candles, Eric, quickly. On the mantel to your right. Suzanne is hurt." In the candlelight, palely golden and swaying, Eric saw Suzanne slumped limply in John's arms. The hem of her golden dress was redly wet, and one cream-colored little shoe was fast becoming soaked with blood from a slash across the instep. "Let's get her over to the window seat, Eric. Do something for her. Oh, sweetheart, don't moan like that." There was no question or reproach in John's voice, only compassion. Eric took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves. His mouth was grimly set, his hands steady, his voice crisply professional. "Take off those shoes, John. She'll be herself then. I mean that she'll be Suzanne, not a murderess of the Medicis. Take them off, John. They're at the bottom of this." "You mean?" John's voice was breathless, his lips trembling. "I mean those hellish boots have changed Suzanne from a sweet and lovely girl to... Well, do as I tell you. I'll be back with gauze and some things I need." When Eric hurried back, there were 3 servants grouped at the dining room door. He spoke to them brusquely, and they left, wide-eyed and whispering. Eric closed the door. While the wet leaves tapped against the windows and stars struggled through the clouds, Eric worked, silently, expertly, grimly, by the light of a flashlight held in John's unsteady hands and the light of the flickering candles. The house lights were all snuffed out by the storm. "There," Eric gave a satisfied grunt. The brothers stood looking at Suzanne, who seemed asleep. Her golden dress glimmered in the candlelight, and the pearls were slipping from her dark hair. The Medici boots lay in a limp and bloody heap in the corner, where Eric had flung them. When she awakes, I shouldn't tell her about any of this, if I were you, John. There are things you haven't told me, Eric, aren't there? Things about the Medici boots. Eric looked steadily at his brother. Yes, old fellow, and after I've told you, those boots must be destroyed. We'll burn them before this night is over. We mustn't move her now. We'll go out on the terrace. It's wet there, but the air is fresh. Did you smell something peculiar? For, as they passed the corner where the Medici boots lay slashed and bloody, Eric could have sworn that there came to him a horrid odor, fetid, hotly offensive, the odor of iniquity and ancient bloody death. As I entered John Kieron's study, I was too much engrossed in my own thoughts to notice at first the haggard appearance of his visitor, a big, handsome young fellow, well known to me. "Hello, Kieron," I greeted. "Hello, Gordon. Haven't seen you for a while. How's Evelyn?" And before he could answer, still on the crest of the enthusiasm which had brought me here, I exclaimed, "Look here, you fellows, I've got something that will make you stare. I got it from that robber, Ahmed Mektub, and I paid high for it, but it's worth it. Look." From under my coat, I drew the jewel-hilted Afghan dagger, which had fascinated me as a collector of rare weapons. Kieron, familiar with my passion, showed only polite interest, but the effect on Gordon was shocking. With a strangled cry, he sprang up and backward, knocking the chair clattering to the floor. Fists clenched and countenance livid, he faced me, crying, "Keep back! Get away from me, or—" I was frozen in my tracks. "What in the—" I began bewilderedly, when Gordon, with another amazing change of attitude, dropped into a chair and sank his head into his hands. I saw his heavy shoulders quiver. I stared helplessly from him to Kieron, who seemed equally dumbfounded. "Is he drunk?" I asked. Kieron shook his head and, filling a brandy glass, offered it to the man. Gordon looked up with haggard eyes, seized the drink and gulped it down like a man half-famished. Then he straightened up and looked at us shamefacedly. "I'm sorry I went off the handle, O'Donnell," he said. "It was the unexpected shock of you drawing that knife." "Well," I retorted with some disgust, "I suppose you thought I was going to stab you with it." "Yes, I did." Then, at the utterly blank expression on my face, he added, "Oh, I didn't actually think that. At least I didn't reach that conclusion by any process of reasoning. It was just the blind primitive instinct of a hunted man, against whom anyone's hand may be turned." His strange words and the despairing way he said them sent a queer shiver of nameless apprehension down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I demanded uneasily. "Hunted? For what? You never committed a crime in your life." "Not in this life, perhaps," he muttered. "What do you mean?" "What if retribution for a crime committed in a previous life were hounding me?" he said. "That's nonsense," I snorted. "Oh, is it?" he exclaimed, stung. "Did you ever hear of my great-grandfather, Sir Richard Gordon of Argyll?" "Sure, but what's that got to do with—" "You've seen his portrait. Doesn't it resemble me?" "Well, yes," I admitted, "except that your expression is frank and wholesome, whereas his is crafty and cruel." "He murdered his wife," answered Gordon. "Suppose the theory of reincarnation were true. Why shouldn't a man suffer in one life for a crime committed in another?" "You mean you think you are the reincarnation of your great-grandfather? Of all the fantastic—" "Well, since he killed his wife, I suppose you'll be expecting Evelyn to murder you." This last was delivered in searing sarcasm, as I thought of the sweet, gentle girl Gordon had married. His answer stunned me. "My wife," he said slowly, "has tried to kill me 3 times in the past week." There was no reply to that. I glanced helplessly at John Kieron. He sat in his customary position, chin resting on his strong, slim hands. His white face was immobile, but his dark eyes gleamed with interest. In the silence, I heard a clock ticking like a death watch. "Tell us the full story, Gordon," suggested Kieron, and his calm, even voice was like a knife that cut a strangling, relieving the unreal tension. "You know we've been married less than a year," Gordon began, plunging into the tale as though he were bursting for utterance. His words stumbled and tripped over one another. "All couples have spats, of course, but we've never had any real quarrels. Evelyn is the best-natured girl in the world. The first thing out of the ordinary occurred about a week ago. We had driven up in the mountains, left the car, and we were wandering around picking wildflowers. At last we came to a steep slope, some 30 feet in height, and Evelyn called my attention to the flowers which grew thickly at the foot. I was looking over the edge and wondering if I could climb down without tearing my clothes to ribbons, when I felt a violent shove from behind that toppled me over. If it had been a sheer cliff, I'd have broken my neck. As it was, I went tumbling down, rolling and sliding, and brought up at the bottom scratched and bruised, with my garments in rags. I looked up and saw Evelyn staring down, apparently frightened half out of her wits. "Oh, Jim," she cried, "are you hurt? How came you to fall?" It was on the tip of my tongue to tell her that there was such a thing as carrying a joke too far, but these words checked me. I decided that she must have stumbled against me unintentionally and actually didn't know it was she who precipitated me down the slope. So I laughed it off and went home. She made a great fuss over me, insisted on swabbing my scratches with iodine, and lectured me for my carelessness. I hadn't the heart to tell her it was her fault. But 4 days later, the next thing happened. I was walking along our driveway when I saw her coming up it in the automobile. I stepped out on the grass to let her by, as there isn't any curb along the driveway. She was smiling as she approached me and slowed down the car as if to speak to me. Then, just before she reached me, a most horrible change came over her expression. Without warning, the car leaped at me like a living thing as she drove her foot down on the accelerator. Only a frantic leap backwards saved me from being ground under the wheels. The car shot across the lawn and crashed into a tree. I ran to it and found Evelyn dazed and hysterical, but unhurt. She babbled of losing control of the machine. I carried her into the house and sent for Dr. Donnelly. He found nothing seriously wrong with her and attributed her dazed condition to fright and shock. Within half an hour, she regained her normal senses, but she's refused to touch the wheel since. Strange to say, she seemed less frightened on her own account than on mine. She seemed vaguely to know that she'd nearly run me down, and grew hysterical again when she spoke of it. Yet she seemed to take it for granted that I knew the machine had got out of her control. But I distinctly saw her wrench the wheel around, and I know she deliberately tried to hit me. Why, God alone knows. Still, I refused to let my mind follow the channel it was getting into. Evelyn had never given any evidence of any psychological weakness or nerves. She's always been a level-headed girl, wholesome and natural. But I began to think she was subject to crazy impulses. Most of us have felt the impulse to leap from tall buildings. And sometimes a person feels a blind, childish, and utterly reasonless urge to harm someone. We pick up a pistol and the thought suddenly enters our mind how easy it would be to send our friend, who sits smiling and unaware, into eternity with the touch of a trigger. Of course we don't do it, but the impulse is there. So I thought perhaps some lack of mental discipline made Evelyn susceptible to these unguided impulses and unable to control them. "Nonsense," I broke in. "I've known her since she was a baby. If she has any such trait, she's developed it since she married you." It was an unfortunate remark. Gordon caught it up with a despairing gleam in his eyes. "That's just it. Since she married me. It's a curse. A black, ghastly curse crawling like a serpent out of the past. I tell you, I was Richard Gordon and she was Lady Elizabeth, his murdered wife." His voice sank to a blood-freezing whisper. I shuddered. It is an awful thing to look upon the ruin of a keen, clean brain, and such I was certain that I surveyed in James Gordon. Why or how, or by what grisly chance it had come about, I could not say, but I was certain the man was mad. "You spoke of 3 attempts. It was John Kieran's voice again, calm and stable amid the gathering webs of horror and unreality. "Look here." Gordon lifted his arm, drew back the sleeve, and displayed a bandage, the cryptic significance of which was intolerable. "I came into the bathroom this morning looking for my razor," he said. "I found Evelyn just on the point of using my best shaving implement for some feminine purpose, to cut out a pattern or something. Like many women, she can't seem to realize the difference between a razor and a butcher knife and a pair of shears. I was a bit irritated, and I said, 'Evelyn, how many times have I told you not to use my razors for such things? Bring it here, I'll give you my pocket knife.' 'I'm sorry, Jim,' she said. 'I didn't know it would hurt the razor. Here it is.' She was advancing, holding the open razor toward me. I reached for it. Then something warned me. It was the same look in her eyes, just as I had seen the day she nearly ran over me. That was all that saved my life, for I instinctively threw up my hand, just as she slashed at my throat with all her power. The blade gashed my arm, as you see, before I caught her wrist. For an instant she fought me like a wild thing. Her slender body was taut as steel beneath my hands. Then she went limp, and the look in her eyes was replaced by a strange, dazed expression. The razor slipped out of her fingers. I let go of her, and she stood swaying as if about to faint. I went to the lavatory. My wound was bleeding in a beastly fashion, and the next thing I heard her cry out, and she was hovering over me. "Jim," she cried, "how did you cut yourself so terribly?" Gordon shook his head and sighed heavily. "I guess I was a bit out of my head. My self-control snapped." "Don't keep up this pretense, Evelyn," I said. "God knows what's got into you, but you know as well as I that you've tried to kill me 3 times in the past week." She recoiled as if I'd struck her, catching at her breast and staring at me as if at a ghost. She didn't say a word, and just what I said I don't remember. But when I finished, I left her standing there white and still as a marble statue. I got my arm bandaged at a drugstore, and then came over here, not knowing what else to do. "Kieron, O'Donnell, it's damnable. Either my wife is subject to fits of insanity—" He choked on the word. "No, I can't believe it. Ordinarily, her eyes are too clear and level, too utterly sane. But every time she has an opportunity to harm me, she seems to become a temporary maniac." He beat his fists together in his impotence and agony. "But it isn't insanity. I used to work in a psychopathic ward, and I've seen every form of mental imbalance. My wife is not insane." "Then what?" I began, but he turned haggard eyes on me. "Only one alternative remains," he answered. "It is the old curse, from the days when I walked the earth with a heart as black as hell's darkest pits, and did evil in the sight of man and of God. She knows, in fleeting snatches of memory. People have seen before, have glimpsed forbidden things in momentary liftings of the veil, which bars life from life. She was Elizabeth Douglas, the ill-fated bride of Richard Gordon, whom he murdered in jealous frenzy, and the vengeance is hers. I shall die by her hands, as it was meant to be. And she—" He bowed his head in his hands. "Just a moment." It was Kieron again. "You have mentioned a strange look in your wife's eyes. What sort of a look? Was it of maniacal frenzy?" Gordon shook his head. It was an utter blankness. All the life and intelligence simply vanished, leaving her eyes dark wells of emptiness. Kieron nodded and asked a seemingly irrelevant question. "Have you any enemies?" "Not that I know of." "You forget Joseph Rolock," I said. "I can't imagine that elegant sophisticate going to the trouble of doing you actual harm, but I have an idea that if he could discomfort you without any physical effort on his part, he'd do it with a right goodwill." Kieron turned on me an eye that suddenly became piercing. "And who is this Joseph Rolock?" "A young exquisite who came into Evelyn's life and nearly rushed her off her feet for a while. But in the end, she came back to her first love, Gordon here. Rolock took it pretty hard. For all his suaveness, there's a streak of violence and passion in the man that might have cropped out but for his infernal indolence and blasé indifference." "Oh, there's nothing to be said against Rolock," interrupted Gordon impatiently. "He must know that Evelyn never really loved him. He merely fascinated her temporarily with his romantic air." "Well, what has Rolock to do with this matter?" Gordon snarled with the irascibility of frayed nerves. "He's been as friendly as a man could be since Evelyn and I were married. In fact, only a week ago he sent her a ring, which he said was a peace offering and a belated wedding gift. Said that after all, her jilting him was a greater misfortune for her than it was for him, the conceited jackass." "A ring?" Kieron had suddenly come to life. It was as if something hard and steely had been sounded in him. "What sort of a ring?" "Oh, a fantastic thing. Copper, made like a scaly snake coiled 3 times, with its tail in its mouth, and yellow jewels for eyes. I gather he picked it up somewhere in Hungary." "He's traveled a great deal in Hungary?" Gordon looked surprised at this questioning, but answered. "Well, apparently the man's traveled everywhere. I put him down as the pampered son of a millionaire. He never did any work, so far as I know." "He's a great student," I put in. "I've been up to his apartment several times, and I never saw such a collection of books." Gordon leaped to his feet with an oath. "Are we all crazy?" he cried. "I came up here hoping to get some help, and you fellows fall to talking of Joseph Rolock. I'll go to Dr. Donnelly." "Wait." Kieron stretched out a detaining hand. "If you don't mind, we'll go over to your house. I'd like to talk to your wife." Gordon dumbly acquiesced. Harried and haunted by grisly forebodings, he knew not which way to turn and welcomed anything that promised aid. We drove over in his car, and scarcely a word was spoken on the way. Gordon was sunk in moody ruminations, and Kieron had withdrawn himself into some strange aloof domain of thought beyond my ken. He sat like a statue, his dark, vital eyes staring into space, not blankly, but as one who looks with understanding into some far realm. Though I counted the man as my best friend, I knew but little of his past. He had come into my life as abruptly and unannounced as Joseph Rolock had come into the life of Evelyn Ash. I had met him at the Wanderers Club, which is composed of the drift of the world, travelers, eccentrics, and all manner of men whose paths lie outside the beaten tracks of life. I had been attracted to him and intrigued by his strange powers and deep knowledge. I vaguely knew that he was the black sheep younger son of a titled Irish family, and that he had walked many strange ways. Gordon's mention of Hungary struck a chord in my memory. One phase of his life Kieron had once let drop fragmentarily. I only knew that he had once suffered a bitter grief and a savage wrong, and that it had been in Hungary. But the nature of the episode I did not know. At Gordon's house, Evelyn met us calmly, showing inner agitation only by the over-restraint of her manner. I saw the beseeching look she stole at her husband. She was a slender, soft-spoken girl, whose dark eyes were always vibrant and alight with emotion. That child tried to murder her adored husband. The idea was monstrous. Again, I was convinced that James Gordon himself was deranged. Following Kieron's lead, we made a pretense of small talk, as if we had casually dropped in, but I felt that Evelyn was not deceived. Our conversation rang false and hollow, and presently Kieron said, "Mrs. Gordon, that is a remarkable ring you are wearing. Do you mind if I look at it?" "I'll have to give you my hand," she laughed. "I've been trying to get it off today, and it won't come off." She held out her slim white hand for Kieron's inspection, and his voice was immobile as he looked at the metal snake that coiled about her slim finger. He did not touch it. I myself was aware of an unaccountable repulsion. There was something almost obscene about that dull, copperish reptile wound about the girl's white finger. "It's evil-looking, isn't it?" She involuntarily shivered. At first I liked it, but now I can hardly bear to look at it. If I can get it off, I intend to return it to Joseph, Mr. Rolock. Kieron was about to make some reply when the doorbell rang. Gordon jumped as if shot, and Evelyn rose quickly. "I'll answer it, Jim. I know who it is." She returned an instant later with two more mutual friends, those inseparable cronies, Dr. Donnelly, whose burly body, jovial manner, and booming voice were combined with as keen a brain as any in the profession, and Bill Bain, elderly, lean, wiry, acidly witty. Both were old friends of the Ash family. Dr. Donnelly had ushered Evelyn into the world, and Bain was always Uncle Bill to her. "Howdy, Jim. Howdy, Mr. Kieron," roared Donnelly. "Hey, O'Donnell, have you got any firearms with you? Last time you nearly blew my head off showing me an old flintlock pistol that wasn't supposed to be loaded." "Dr. Donnelly?" We all turned. Evelyn was standing beside a wide table, holding it as if for support. Her face was white. Our badinage ceased instantly. A sudden tension was in the air. "Dr. Donnelly," she repeated, holding her voice steady by an effort. "I sent for you and Uncle Bill for the same reason for which I know Jim has brought Mr. Kieron and Michael. There is a matter Jim and I can no longer deal with alone. There is something between us, something black and ghastly and terrible." "What are you talking about, girl?" All the levity was gone from Donnelly's great voice. "My husband," she choked, then went blindly on. "My husband has accused me of trying to murder him." The silence that fell was broken by Bain's sudden and energetic rise. His eyes blazed and his fists quivered. "You young pup," he shouted at Gordon. "I'll knock the living daylights—" "Sit down, Bill." Donnelly's huge hand crushed his smaller companion back into his chair. "No use going off half-cocked. Go ahead, honey." "We need help. We cannot carry this thing alone." A shadow crossed her comely face. "This morning Jim's arm was badly cut. He said I did it. I don't know. I was handing him the razor, then I must have fainted. At least everything faded away. When I came to myself, he was washing his arm in the lavatory, and he accused me of trying to kill him." "Why, the young fool," barked the belligerent Bain, "hasn't he sense enough to know that if you did cut him, it was an accident?" "Shut up, won't you?" snorted Donnelly. "Honey, did you say you fainted? That isn't like you." "I've been having fainting spells," she answered. "The first time was when we were in the mountains and Jim fell down a cliff. We were standing on the edge, then everything went black, and when my sight cleared, he was rolling down the slope." She shuddered at the recollection. "Then when I lost control of the car and it crashed into the tree, you remember, Jim called you over." Dr. Donnelly nodded his head ponderously. I don't remember you ever having fainting spells before. But Jim says I pushed him over the cliff, she cried hysterically. He says I tried to run him down in the car. He says I purposely slashed him with the razor. Dr. Donnelly turned perplexedly toward the wretched Gordon. How about it, son? God help me, Gordon burst out in agony. It's true. You lying hound. It was Bane who gave tongue, leaping again to his feet. If you want a divorce, why don't you get it in a decent way instead of resorting to these despicable tactics? Damn you, roared Gordon, lunging up and losing control of himself completely. If you say that, I'll tear your jugular out. Evelyn screamed. Donnelly grabbed Bane ponderously and banged him back into his chair with no overly gentle touch, and Kieron laid a hand lightly on Gordon's shoulder. The man seemed to crumple into himself. He sank back into his chair and held out his hands gropingly toward his wife. Evelyn, he said, his voice thick with laboring emotion, you know I love you. I feel like a dog, but God help me, it's true. If we go on this way, I'll be a dead man, and you... Don't say it, she screamed. I know you wouldn't lie to me, Jim. If you say I tried to kill you, I know I did. But I swear, Jim, I didn't do it consciously. I must be going mad. That's why my dreams have been so wild and terrifying lately. Of what have you dreamed, Mrs. Gordon? Asked Kieron gently. She pressed her hands to her temples and stared dully at him, as if only half comprehending. A black thing, she muttered. A horrible, faceless black thing that mows and mumbles and paws over me with apish hands. I dream of it every night, and in the daytime I try to kill the only man I ever loved. I'm going mad. Maybe I'm already crazy and don't know it. Calm yourself, honey. To Dr. Donnelly, with all his science, it was only another case of feminine hysteria. His matter-of-fact voice seemed to soothe her, and she sighed and drew a weary hand through her damp locks. We'll talk this all over, and everything's going to be okay, he said, drawing a thick cigar from his vest pocket. Give me a match, honey. She began mechanically to feel about the table, and just as mechanically, Gordon said, There are matches in the drawer, Evelyn. She opened the drawer and began groping in it, when suddenly, as if struck by recollection and intuition, Gordon sprang up, white-faced, and shouted, No, don't open that drawer, don't! Even as he voiced that urgent cry, she stiffened, as if at the feel of something in the drawer. Her change of expression held us all frozen, even Kieron. The vital intelligence vanished from her eyes like a blown-out flame, and into them came the look Gordon had described as blank. The term was descriptive. Her beautiful eyes were dark wells of emptiness, as if the soul had been withdrawn from behind them. Her hand came out of the drawer holding a pistol, and she fired point blank. Gordon reeled with a groan and went down, blood starting from his head. For a flashing instant, she looked down stupidly at the smoking gun in her hand, like one suddenly waking from a nightmare. Then her wild scream of agony smote our ears. Oh God, I've killed him! Jim! Jim! She reached him before any of us, throwing herself on her knees and cradling his bloody head in her arms, while she sobbed in an unbearable passion of horror and anguish. The emptiness was gone from her eyes. They were alive and dilated with grief and terror. I was making toward my prostrate friend with Donnelly and Bane, but Kieron caught my arm. His face was no longer immobile. His eyes glittered with a controlled savagery. Leave him to them, he snarled. We are hunters, not healers. Lead me to the house of Joseph Rolock. I did not question him. We drove there in Gordon's car. I had the wheel, and something about the grim face of my companion caused me to hurl the machine recklessly through the traffic. I had the sensation of being part of a tragic drama which was hurtling with headlong speed toward a terrible climax. I wrenched the car to a grinding halt at the curb before the building where Rolock lived, in a bizarre apartment high above the city. The very elevator that shot us skyward seemed imbued with something of Kieron's driving urge for haste. I pointed out Rolock's door, and he cast it open without knocking and shouldered his way in. I was close at his heels. Rolock, in a dressing gown of Chinese silk worked with dragons, was lounging on a divan, puffing quickly at a cigarette. He sat up, overturning a wine glass which stood with a half-filled bottle at his elbow. Before Kieron could speak, I burst out with our news. James Gordon has been shot. He sprang to his feet. Shot? When? When did she kill him? She? I glared in bewilderment. How did you know? With a steely hand, Kieron thrust me aside, and as the men faced each other, I saw recognition flare up in Rolock's face. They made a strong contrast. Kieron, tall, pale with some white-hot passion. Rolak, slim, darkly handsome, with the Saracenic arch of his slim brows above his black eyes. I realized that whatever else occurred, it lay between those two men. They were not strangers. I could sense like a tangible thing the hate that lay between them. "John Kieron," softly whispered Rolak. "You remember me, Yosef Rolak." Only an iron control kept Kieron's voice steady. The other merely stared at him without speaking. "Years ago," said Kieron more deliberately, "when we delved into the dark mysteries together in Budapest, I saw where you were drifting. I drew back. I would not descend to the foul depths of forbidden occultism and diabolism to which you sank. And because I would not, you despised me, and you robbed me of the only woman I ever loved. You turned her against me by means of your vile arts, and then you degraded and debauched her, sank her into your own foul slime. I had killed you with my own hands then, Yosef Rolak, vampire by nature as well as by name that you are, but your arts protected you from physical vengeance. But you have trapped yourself at last." Kieron's voice rose in fierce exultation. All his cultured restraint had been swept away from him, leaving a primitive elemental man, raging and gloating over a hated foe. "You sought the destruction of James Gordon and his wife because she unwittingly escaped your snare." Rolak shrugged his shoulders and laughed. "You are mad. I've not seen the Gordons for weeks. Why blame me for their family troubles?" Kieron snarled. "Liar, as always. What did you say just now when O'Donnell told you Gordon had been shot? When did she kill him? You were expecting to hear that the girl had killed her husband. Your psychic powers had told you that a climax was close at hand. You were nervously awaiting news of the success of your devilish scheme. But I did not need a slip of your tongue to recognize your handiwork. I knew as soon as I saw the ring on Evelyn Gordon's finger, the ring she could not remove, the ancient and accursed ring of Thoth Amon, handed down by foul cults of sorcerers since the days of forgotten Stygia. I knew that ring was yours, and I knew by what ghastly rights you came to possess it, and I knew its power. Once she put it on her finger, in her innocence and ignorance, she was in your power. By your black magic you summoned the black elemental spirit, the haunter of the ring, out of the gulfs of night and the ages. Here in your accursed chamber you performed unspeakable rituals to drive Evelyn Gordon's soul from her body, and to cause that body to be possessed by that godless sprite from outside the human universe. She was too clean and wholesome, her love for her husband too strong, for the fiend to gain complete and permanent possession of her body. Only for brief instants could it drive her own spirit into the void and animate her form. But that was enough for your purpose. But you brought ruin upon yourself by your vengeance." Kieron's voice rose to a feline screech. "What was the price demanded by the fiend you drew from the pits? Ha, you blanch! Yosef Rolak is not the only man to have learned forbidden secrets. After I left Hungary, a broken man, I took up again the study of the black arts, to trap you, you cringing serpent. I explored the ruins of Zimbabwe, the lost mountains of Inner Mongolia, and the forgotten jungle islands of the southern seas. I learned what sickened my soul so that I forswore occultism forever, but I learned of the black spirit that deals death by the hand of a beloved one, and is controlled by a master of magic. But Yosef Rolak, you are not an adept. You have not the power to control the fiend you have invoked, and you have sold your soul." The Hungarian tore at his collar as if it were a strangling noose. His face had changed, as if a mask had dropped away. He looked much older. "You lie," he panted. "I did not promise him my soul." "I do not lie." Kieron's shriek was shocking in its wild exultation. "I know the price a man must pay for calling forth a nameless shape that roams the gulfs of darkness. Look, there in the corner behind you. A nameless, sightless thing is laughing, is mocking you. It has fulfilled its bargain, and it has come for you, Yosef Rolak." "No, no," shrieked Rolak, tearing his limp collar away from his sweating throat. His composure had crumpled, and his demoralization was sickening to see. "I tell you it was not my soul. I promised it a soul, but not my soul. He must take the soul of the girl, or of James Gordon." "Fool," roared Kieron. "Do you think he could take the souls of innocents, that he would not know they were beyond his reach? The girl and the youth he could kill, their souls were not his to take or yours to give. But your black soul is not beyond his reach, and he will have his wage. Look, he is materializing behind you. He's growing out of thin air." Was it the hypnosis inspired by Kieron's burning words that caused me to shudder and grow cold? to feel an icy chill that was not of earth pervade the room. Was it a trick of light and shadow that seemed to produce the effect of a black anthropomorphic shadow on the wall behind the Hungarian? No, by heaven. It grew, it swelled. Vrolak had not turned. He stared at Kieron with eyes starting from his head, hair standing stiffly on his scalp, sweat dripping from his livid face. Kieron's cry started shudders down my spine. Look behind you, I see him. He's come, he's here. His grisly mouth gapes in awful laughter. His misshapen paws reach for you. And then at last Vrolak wheeled, with an awful shriek, throwing his arms above his head in a gesture of wild despair. And for one brain-shattering instant he was blotted out by a great black shadow. Kieron grasped my arm, and we fled from that accursed chamber, blind with horror. The same paper, which bore a brief item telling of James Gordon having suffered a slight scalp wound by the accidental discharge of a pistol in his home, headlined the sudden death of Joseph Vrolak, wealthy and eccentric clubman in his sumptuous apartments, apparently from heart failure. I read it at breakfast, while I drank cup after cup of black coffee from a hand that was not too steady, even after the lapse of a night. Across the table from me, Kieron likewise seemed to lack appetite. He brooded, as if he roamed again through bygone years. Gordon's fantastic theory of reincarnation was wild enough, I said at last, but the actual facts were still more incredible. Tell me, Kieron, was that last scene the result of hypnosis? Was it the power of your words that made me seem to see a black horror grow out of the air and rip Josef Vrolak's soul from his living body? He shook his head. No human hypnotism would strike that black-hearted devil dead on the floor. No, there are beings outside the ken of common humanity, foul shapes of transcosmic evil. Such a one it was with which Vrolak dealt. But how could it claim his soul? I persisted. If indeed such an awful bargain had been struck, it had not fulfilled its part, for James Gordon was not dead, but merely knocked senseless. Vrolak did not know it, answered Kieron. He thought that Gordon was dead, and I convinced him that he himself had been trapped and was doomed. In his demoralization, he fell easy prey to the thing he called forth. It, of course, was always watching for a moment of weakness on his part. The powers of darkness never deal fairly with human beings. He who traffics with them is always cheated in the end. It's a mad nightmare, I muttered, but it seems to me then that you, as much as anything else, brought about Vrolak's death. It is gratifying to think so, Kieron answered. Evelyn Gordon is safe now, and it is a small repayment for what he did to another girl years ago and in a far country.